President Zelensky has given one of the most important speeches of his career to the UN General Assembly. Just what does he need to communicate to the world? And did it contain some coded messages for some other folks? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so we're not going to go over the whole script word for word, right? That's a little much. But what I wanted to break down is some of the key points here, because remember, this is a speech where he's addressing the leaders of countries, all right? And now, not all countries are going to send their actual head of state to the UN General Assembly, but they generally send high-level ambassadors. And so this is de facto taken as a message, a publicly delivered message to every single world leader, right? And so what Zelensky needs to do here, or his overall theme, is to try to shore up support for Ukraine as it's starting to look towards the end game of its war, or its defensive war against Russia. Now, what does he need? Well, he does need to make sure that the UN General Assembly, these countries, re-emphasize the stakes. And one of the things that he points out is one of the most brazen and obvious to all of these countries, and that is the nuclear threat that Russia poses, right? He acknowledges that the Russian tanks, that Russia seized the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. It is occupied by Russia, and it has been militarized by Russia, right? It is currently, again, a large number of Russian military personnel are there. We've heard that Russia has been playing some level of games, right, where they burned, for example, all those tires in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant cooling tower to create the perception that there was some sort of nuclear incident that may have taken place. And this kind of nonsense is really something that I think is illustrative of the difference between Russia and really the rest of the globe, right? Where almost no other country in the globe, when there's a nuclear power plant in and around a war zone, do they engage with this level of brinkmanship and just play stupid games with the power plant, right? And he says, in Ukraine, we know exactly who we're dealing with, right, when we talk about Russia. And he says, I want to thank the General Assembly members for adopting a resolution in July emphasizing the safety of nuclear facilities in Ukraine, and that most in the world understand what's at stake. So I thought this was interesting, right? And what he's talking about, of course, is not just Putin's targeting of civilian infrastructure. This is something that, again, is war crime adjacent, right? Again, when there is like it's tough to know for sure, right? Because taking out energy infrastructure is a military a tactic, right? Making it harder for your enemy to communicate and move around the battlefield and sort of see and process information, even making it harder for your enemy to conduct civilian governments. Because remember, government officials are on some level, while they're not combatants, they are participants in a war, right? In a war effort. But at some point, Putin, who has deliberately targeted the energy grid going into winter, is clearly targeting not military facilities and military decision-making capacities, but actually is just sort of punishing the Ukrainian civilians, right, who need these power plants to ensure that they can heat their homes in the Ukrainian winter, right? He also is saying that Putin may be planning attacks on nuclear power plants, and as he points out, radiation does not care about borders, and that is a huge problem for anyone. Everyone should worry about the militarization of nuclear power plants, especially if you care about something like climate change, where nuclear power at the end of the day is going to have to be a part of that solution because it is the only clean source of base load energy. And anyone that tells you otherwise is a clueless idiot. So he's saying, listen, if you want a world that's safe for nuclear power, we have to contract Russia's ability to conduct these kinds of operations. And we have to send a message to the rest of the world that you cannot play games with nuclear power plants, with nuclear technology, right? But he also emphasizes, of course, his peace formula. The peace formula makes a number of appearances in the speech. And just to reemphasize, he says the peace formula has actually not changed since November 2022. These are, he calls it the peace formula. It is more of like a key areas where future negotiations will take place along, right? Nuclear safety is number one. Food security, right? The ability to import and export food. Energy security for Ukraine. Release of prisoners and return of Ukrainian children deported to Russia. This has been part of Russia's campaign to Russify the occupied regions by essentially destroying as many Ukrainian kids as possible and replacing their Ukrainian identity with a Russian identity. Fifth is restoring the internationally recognized lines of Ukraine, including Crimea, withdrawal of Russian military forces from Ukraine, prosecution of war crimes, assessment of ecological damage. This is particularly for the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, something that the Russians did as they retreated from Kherson, really damaging a lot of infrastructure in Kherson city. This is like flooding the downtown of like Houston. Prosecution of those responsible, a guarantee against future Russian aggression, and a multilateral binding treaty. So, of course, Sergei Lavrov at the time said this is totally not feasible. It's not possible to implement this. Again, this is not something to implement. The only things that are implementable are things like prosecution for war crime, withdrawal of military forces, restoration of the border. I guess about half of this is like actual terms and conditions, but some of them are not really concrete. Like nuclear safety is too vague. There's no actionable items here. Food security, again, too vague. Energy security and restoration of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, too vague, not specific enough. But some of these other points are actually vague. A guarantee against Russian aggression, that's also vague and could mean just about anything. So I point those things out because, again, this peace formula is just to remind you guys of what Ukraine has been consistent in its stance about what it wants and what constitutes the end of the war. Now, if you guys feel like your own ability to take on the larger challenges of the day, if it feels like sometimes you need an extra something in your corner, right? And I've got it. Strike Gum. Strike Gum has all the caffeine of an energy drink. Each piece has the caffeine of a Red Bull or an Amp Energy with 100 milligrams alpha GPC in each piece. So if you're looking to take your energy game to the next level, you want some Strike Gum, right? Best of all, of course, we have we always have different discounts, but if you subscribe and save, if you know you're part of the 50% of people who try Strike Gum and reorder, then get the subscribe and save option. It's less expensive, and you get free shipping. Right? We also have 4.9 stars on Amazon. A huge thank you to all you guys that left us those great reviews. We really appreciate it. And of course, we're on Amazon. And if you're a Strike Gum fan, then spread the word, man. Leave us those reviews. Check the link in the description to get your Strike Gum today. Okay. There's some more stuff that I wanted to mention, right? Zelensky calls out what Russia's very special buddies. I think this is funny, right? He says Russia's found very special buddies for their support. North Korea and Iran, which he says is a telling choice of friends. And this is one of the things that I emphasize a lot, is that Russia has very few countries that support it and also adhere to anything resembling democratic norms, right? Iran, North Korea, these are really very oppressive states. Again, worth noting, Iran has routinely, as their official state policy, called for the complete elimination of the state of Israel and all Jews at times, which, regardless of how you feel about Israeli policy, Iran is also bad. Like, Iran is not full of good people who just want the world to live in harmony. Again, their official state stance is to exterminate an entire country. North Korea, of course, has no discernible human rights, notorious for its brutal execution, its absolute willingness to just imprison and kill the families of people who criticize the government, defect. They have the largest per capita prison camps in the world. If they could ever, or at least we estimate, and we don't really know because we don't have that many statistics about North Korea. But this is who Russia considers their allies. They also, he doesn't say it, but they also have China. But China also is a country governed by a single party communist dictator. They're not actually all that communist, though, right? But the reality is that is exactly who you should understand friends to be, right? And that is why one of the reasons that Russia cannot emerge victorious from this Ukraine incursion, because it's going to tell these other folks that, if you can wait them out 3 years, the West, they're not really going to go to bat for whoever you want. So if Iran, if now's the time to, get rid of that pesky Israel, now's the time to do it because the West won't really back them up that much. North Korea, if you want to go reunify with the South, as long as you can stretch them out 3 years, they won't. They'll bail, right? And those choices are not by accident. They're both countries, again, that have real concrete, whose official policy is the destruction of their neighboring states. And so it reminds everyone to say, listen, if you don't want to see South Korea subsumed by the North or embroiled in a massive war with the North, and you don't want to see Iran execute on its policy of eliminating Israel's existence, then you probably should think about deterring Russia and its plans to eliminate Ukrainian statehood. Right? So one of the things that's interesting is that he talks about the fact that, yes, Zelensky's like, listen, a lot of these governments have met with us. And I think this is pretty funny. He says, here at the UN, I've met with leaders from India, Guatemala, Japan, Italy, Turkey, Finland, Canada, Paraguay, Slovenia, Germany, and others. And what I find interesting is the grouping he's done here. There's a little bit of a message here. You notice the first country he states is India. And we've talked about the fact that India has sort of been playing both sides. India's signed some big deals with Russia. India's been very publicly courted by Putin, but it's also recently been sort of outed, for lack of a better term, for selling a lot of artillery to Ukraine. And there is recently an announcement with President Biden that a large production facility was going to be opened in India, I believe to produce munitions for Ukraine, but it may also just be like a chip factory or something. The point is that Zelensky there's this campaign to sit there and go, listen, you can't be friends with Russia and the United States. And so we're trying our best to say, and India is already clearly the West's friend, right? So they're saying, listen, I know Putin's been trying to get you to be his friend, but you can't be Putin's friend and our friend. And look at all the ways in which you're already our friend. And, oh yeah, look at all the additional things we can do to help you that simply a sanctioned, struggling Russia cannot. And so the fact that Zelensky's outing to the UN General Assembly, hey, India is in the same breath with Japan and Canada and Germany, right? And India wants to be that, right? India wants to be regarded as a world superpower. And it's on its pace to. It has the population. It has much of the education infrastructure. It's just got an industrialization problem. Right? It just needs an economy to match. Turkey, another example of a country that's trying to play both sides against each other, and one that's much more pushed away from the West. But the fact is that they also play both sides. And again, it's the same thing. Zelensky's trying to send the message to say, listen, you can only be on one side, and you've been very publicly already on ours. So again, some of these little digs are in here, right? So this is another dig that's actually pretty explicit, right? He says, when some propose alternatives, and this is, I think, an example of the Russian alternatives, which are almost point for point the alternative proposal proposed by Trump and J.D. Vance, which is to give Putin exactly what he wants, which is a large portion of Ukraine, and a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO, leaving the door open for Russian influence or just the resumption of Russian aggression, again, once NATO's promised not to help Ukraine. He says these alternatives and half-hearted settlement plans, so-called sense of principles, ignores the interest in suffering of Ukrainians, but also ignores reality and gives Putin the political space to continue the war and pressure the world to bring more nations under control, right? Again, he says any alternative attempts to seek peace, he means negotiations that bypass the Ukrainian government. This is, again, I think a reference to Trump, who has said he is going to end the war in 24 hours. But the reality is that Trump, again, and the United States is not a party. They're not an aggressor in this war. And in the peace treaty, the state of peace already exists between Russia and the United States. The state of war exists between Russia and Ukraine. So you cannot broker a peace deal without both of the belligerents, without both of the warring parties. And so that's why Zelensky says, listen, you could try to seek peace in 24 hours, but whatever you achieve is just going to be a lull instead of an end to the war. Because as we point out in the peace formula, this war did not start in 2022. It escalated in 2022, but it began with the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia. So this is a 10-year-long conflict. And this is why it's so hard to solve. This is why good, skilled, smart diplomats understand this. And remember, when Putin did this, people say, just let him have it. Just let him have it. Listen, that was the policy in 2014. In 2014, we said, listen, we're going to sanction some of your oligarchs, but it's not cool that you stole Russian territory or Ukrainian territory and tried to make it Russian. But nothing's really going to happen to you. We're not really, the international response can be pretty muted, right? The non-binding resolution by the UN said that was bad, that seizing Crimea was bad, right? Some people even said that it was a military intervention or invasion, right? But some people said nothing, right? And again, they said, oh, it's going to be harder for Russians to get visas to Europe. Japan said they're not going to talk to Russia about anything. The United Kingdom said some mean things about the annexation. That was it, guys. That was it. That was what we did. And I point this out because just let them have it is exactly what he's talking about. You're just going to cause another break until Putin decides, hey, I'm going to take what I want. Now, chances are Putin won't do it with another military intervention. He doesn't have to. If the U.S. gets forced out of Ukraine and the West is no longer influencing Ukraine, then Putin's going to say, well, it's easy. I'm just going to install my own dictator. I'm going to do the same thing I've done in Moldova, the same thing we did in the Eastern Bloc as the Soviet Union. We're just going to put our governments in place, right? They already did it in Ukraine with Lukashenko. They'll do it again. He knows how to do it. And so that's the thing. That's the thing that Zelensky wants people to understand, is that this is not in a vacuum. You have to understand this is not a war that emerged from a state of peace. It is a war that escalated from a state of like low intensity war that became high intensity, right? It was a simmering pot that became a rolling boil, right? So again, I think this is some of the takeaways. There's a lot of messages here for a lot of folks. What I also thought was a huge call out, right? If someone in the world seeks alternatives to the peace formula or try to ignore them, it means they themselves want to do part of what Putin is doing, right? The point they ignore reveals the desire they're hiding. So he says, when the Chinese and Brazilian duo, which is, wow, shots fired, calling out China and Brazil, two major BRICS countries, try to grow into a choir of voices with someone in Europe or someone in Africa saying that there's alternative to a full and just peace. What is their real interest, right? And again, this is primarily because Brazil does a lot of trade with Russia and a lot of trade with China. It's economic interest. And the reality is that you look at this peace formula, and this is the place that you have to start negotiations from. Now, realistically, some of these things absolutely should be non-negotiables. Nuclear safety, the ability of Ukraine to conduct food exports, safety and restoration for Ukraine's energy infrastructure, the return of prisoners and the return of children deported to Russia. This is one of the most brazen Russian war crimes, actually. The restoration of the border is going to be much harder. That's going to be a tough one. Withdrawal of Russian military forces from Ukraine is a non-negotiable, right? Prosecution of war crimes probably won't happen, or it may happen, but the war criminals will sit in Russia. Ecological damage, that always gets thrown out first right away. Guarantees against future Russian aggression. This is probably the biggest, most important point, because that guarantee cannot be ink on a paper that gets crumpled up and stuck on a shelf. That's happened before. That's how, these treaties aren't worth anything. And this is part of the West's failing, is that the reason this is so intractable is because the first time Ukrainian sovereignty got violated, the West did nothing. The West did nothing to coerce Russia to back off. And that meant that there was that now a treaty is not sufficient. Guarantees are what are needed. And that guarantee is going to have to take the form of some real stakes. Again, EU troops sitting on the Ukrainian border. Some kind of EU or NATO force that sits in Ukraine. Ukrainian NATO membership. All of those things are options, but it's very, very difficult to hammer out what that's going to look like, because we refused to address we refused to stop the problem on day one, which was the annexation of Crimea. And now we find ourselves in a war that no one can extract from. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to our Colonel tier members like Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall. Hit that subscribe button. And thanks to all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you. And I will thank you. Thank all of you guys. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.